The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that teaches you who you actually married. Not because anything went wrong, because things went deeply, inconveniently right, and that is its own kind of test. Zara learned that Jaiwan left his shoes precisely at the door and his emotions precisely nowhere near where anyone could find them without patience. Jaiwan learned that Zara cried at commercials about dogs and organized her bookshelves by emotional weight, not alphabetically, and that she would not back down from an argument just because he was the most feared man in Atlanta's underworld. They fought. They came back. They built something in the space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. The Grace O'Coffer Center had expanded, 2 locations now, with a third in the planning stages, and Zara had hired a staff of 12 and written a grant proposal so precise and compelling that the foundation reviewer had called personally to say she'd never seen one quite like it. Carol was in a federal holding facility awaiting sentencing on fraud and arson charges. Keely had moved to her aunt's house in Tampa and stopped answering her phone. The house on Briarcliff had been ordered returned to the O'Coffer estate by a judge who had not enjoyed the afternoon he spent reading the financial irregularities in Carol's arrangement with Tobias's attorney. Zara had not celebrated any of it. She'd felt relief, which is different. She'd slept better, but something kept pulling at the edge of her, some thread she couldn't name, like a sentence that hadn't finished. She was at the center on a Tuesday evening, after everyone had gone home, reviewing renovation quotes for the 3rd location, when she found the envelope. It had been slipped under the front door, her name on the front, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, no return address. Inside, a single photograph. Her father, Tobias O'Coffer, standing in front of a building she'd never seen. Across the street from him, visible in the background, was a man. Zara didn't know his face, but stapled to the back of the photograph was a business card. The name on it read Marcus Chen, and beneath the name, handwritten in different ink, were 4 words. He said no. Remember. Zara sat very still for a long time. Then she called Jaiwan. The silence on his end of the phone lasted exactly 3 seconds longer than any silence she'd heard from him before. "Where are you?" he said. "The center." Another pause. "Stay there. Don't show that to anyone. I'm coming." If you're just finding this channel, welcome. We tell stories here about women who were written off and the love that found them anyway. If this is your kind of story, subscribe and hit the bell. You'll want to be here for what comes next. By the time Jaiwan arrived, Daeho was with him. He usually was. His most trusted lieutenant, the man who had compiled the original folder on Zara 3 years ago, who had sat in countless meetings and never flinched. Jaiwan spread the photograph on the table. Daeho looked at it, and Zara watched something happen in his face that she had never seen there before. It was brief, and it was controlled, and then it was gone. But she saw it. She had spent 3 years learning how to read rooms where she wasn't supposed to matter. She knew what suppressed recognition looked like. "You know that name," she said, not a question. Daeho looked at Jaiwan. Jaiwan looked at the photograph. "Marcus Chen," Jaiwan said quietly, "is my uncle." He set the photo down. "Or was. He died 4 years ago, before I took over the collective." Zara looked at him steadily. "Did he?" The silence that followed was the kind that reorganizes rooms. The history came out the way histories like that one always do, in pieces, some of them sharp. Marcus Chen had built the collective from nothing in the 1990s, had grown it into what it was, and had been, by every official account, killed in a car accident outside Buckhead in the winter before Jaiwan assumed control. There had been a funeral. There had been an estate. Jaiwan had inherited the operation believing his uncle was gone because everyone who should have known had confirmed it, and he was young and grieving and had not thought to question the paperwork. He was 33 now and thinking very differently about paperwork. "The reshuffling," Zara said. It was late. They were at the penthouse, Daeho had gone home, and she was watching Jaiwan from across the kitchen. "You said when you talked about taking over, you called it a brutal reshuffling. You never explained that." He poured tea for her and did not answer immediately. "Men died," he said. "People I'd known my whole life. The story I was given was that Marcus had been building enemies, and his enemies caught up with him, and it spilled over." He set the mug in front of her. "I accepted that. I was 28 and I had a collective to hold together, and I accepted the story I was given." Zara wrapped her hands around the mug. "Who gave you that story?" Jaiwan's jaw shifted. Daeho. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The next 48 hours were the most careful of Jaiwan's professional life, and his professional life had required exceptional care on multiple occasions. He moved his pieces quietly. He pulled surveillance, cross-referenced timelines, and had a forensic accountant he trusted absolutely review certain transactions in the collective's books that had always been attributed to legacy overhead. What the accountant found was a second layer, clean on the surface, compromised underneath. Someone had been siphoning information and occasionally funds to a separate operation for years. The trail went to Daeho. The separate operation led through 7 careful steps to a shell company registered in Delaware. The shell company's founding documents listed one silent partner. The name had been legally changed, but the fingerprints, digitally speaking, were Marcus Chen's. Jaiwan did not confront Daeho. He gathered everything first. He was precise. He was deliberate. He trusted almost no one. And now he understood exactly why that had always been wise. On the third night, Zara didn't come home. She had been at the center alone, which she was not supposed to be, having sent her last staff member home and stayed to finish the grant report that was due in the morning. This was her habit, and Jaiwan had never loved it, and now he stood in the penthouse at 11:45, watching her location on his phone go from the center to somewhere east of downtown, and then stop moving entirely, and he felt something he had not felt since he was very young, which was the specific terror of being completely unprepared. He called. No answer. He called again. Voicemail. He called Daeho out of reflex and then stopped himself mid-dial and hung up and called someone else, a woman named Hyunji, who had been his logistics coordinator for 6 years and whose loyalty he had never once questioned, and who answered on the first ring. "Find her," he said. "Everything." What came back in the next hour came in pieces, and each piece was worse than the one before it. The center's security footage showed Zara leaving at 11:12. A black car, not theirs, had been parked a half block away since 9. She had gotten into it, not under duress as visible from the camera angle, which meant she had been approached in a way that made her believe she was safe, or believe the alternative was worse. Her phone was at a warehouse on the east side, active but not answering. The warehouse had been in Shin Collective Records once, years ago, as a property that had been sold. The name on the sale documents was a name Jaiwan recognized. It was Daeho's brother-in-law's LLC. Jaiwan was in the car before Hyunji finished the sentence. This is the part of the story where I need you to stay with me. Hit that like button so the algorithm keeps this where it can find the people who need it, and drop a comment if you felt that. Let's keep going. Zara was not, by the time Jaiwan arrived at that warehouse, in the condition anyone might have assumed. She was sitting in a folding chair at a metal table, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had been provided without being requested, and she was looking at the man across from her with the expression she had perfected over 3 years of living inside someone else's cruelty. Not fear, inventory. She was cataloging every detail of the room, every exit, every face, every piece of information being given to her, and everything being withheld. She had been doing it since the car. Marcus Chen was 61 years old, and he looked like someone who had spent that time learning exactly how much pressure any given thing could take. He was not threatening her, he was talking, and that, Zara had decided early in the conversation, was the most dangerous thing he could be doing. "I didn't bring you here to hurt you. I brought you here because my nephew is about to go to war with someone he thinks is a stranger, and I would prefer he understand what he's actually fighting before someone makes a decision they can't take back." She looked at him for a long time. "You sent me that photograph." "I did." "Why?" He had settled back in his chair with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. The story Marcus told her took an hour. He did not soften it. Her father, Tobias Okafor, had owned a parcel of land in a quadrant of Atlanta that certain people had understood, several years before the market caught up, would become extremely valuable. Marcus had sent people to negotiate. He had sent them twice. Tobias had said no both times, not rudely, not with any drama, but with the particular quiet finality of a man who knew exactly what he was saying no to and did not require anyone's approval for the decision. Marcus had moved on to other approaches. He connected with Carol, who was already in Tobias's orbit, already ambitious, and the arrangement had been Carol's idea more than his. Marcus had provided certain resources. Carol had provided access. The kitchen fire had been intended to intimidate, not injure, and the fact that Zara had been in it was a miscalculation that Marcus said he had not forgiven Carol for, whatever that was worth. Zara's hands were still on the coffee cup. And my father's accident. It was not a question. She had learned from Jaewon that the most important questions sound like statements. Marcus looked at her with something complicated moving through his face. That was Carol, entirely Carol. She had decided she wanted more than the arrangement offered, and she decided Tobias was the obstacle. He paused. I want you to know that I would not have sanctioned it, not because I'm a good man, because it was sloppy and it created exposure. But Carol had stopped asking what I would sanction. His voice was even. She also didn't tell me until after. Zara set down the cup. Her father had not died in an accident. He had been killed because he said no to the wrong person, and the wrong person's associate decided that made him inconvenient. He had been killed because he owned a parcel of land and would not sell it. He had been killed while she was 21 years old and drowning in grief, and had no idea what had actually happened. She breathed. In for 4, out for 4. Dr. Mensah had given her that. Why are you telling me this? Her voice was level. Marcus tilted his head slightly, like he was genuinely considering the question. Because Daeho has been working for me for 3 years, because Jaewon is about to find that out, and when he does, he is going to act in a way that escalates this past any point of return. And my nephew has spent 4 years building something legitimate, and I have no interest in watching him burn it down because of his loyalty to me. He studied her. You're the only one he listens to. Zara said nothing. I also owe you a debt. I don't pay debts in the way that makes people comfortable, but I can give you what you need to finish what was started with Carol. He slid a thin folder across the table. The workplace accident report, the real one, and a statement from the foreman who was paid to change the site records. Zara looked at the folder. She looked at Marcus Chen. You're giving me this not out of guilt. No. You're giving it to me because it destroys Carol completely, and Carol is the one loose end you have that keeps you exposed. A faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Your nephew was right about you. Don't, she said quietly. Don't do that. She picked up the folder. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to walk out of this building, and whatever happens with Jaewon and Daeho is between them. You don't get to use me as the thing that controls that. Marcus said nothing. She stood up. The land my father wouldn't sell. What happened to it? Marcus looked at the table. It's still in your name, through your father's estate. Carol never managed to transfer it before the civil suit froze everything. Zara absorbed that. Good, she said, and walked out. She was 3 steps from the exit when the doors opened from the outside, and Jaewon walked in with 6 people behind him, and the expression of someone who had spent 40 minutes in controlled terror, and now was deciding how to process it.
He saw her. He stopped. The 6 people stopped. I'm fine, she said. I found out some things. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and pulled her in and held her the way he had in the ballroom, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She let herself be held for exactly 1 breath. Jaewon. Yes. Daeho. He stiffened slightly. I know. No, she said. I mean, don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. Let the law have him. Let it all go through the right channels. She pulled back enough to look at his face. You've spent 4 years building something clean. Don't let this be the thing that undoes it. He looked at her for a long time. You walked out of that building by yourself. I walked in by myself too, she said. I've been doing hard things alone for a long time. The difference now is you're here when I come out. What followed was methodical and deliberate and happened entirely in daylight. Dae-ho was handed to federal authorities with documentation so complete that his attorney took one look at it and advised him to cooperate. He cooperated. Marcus Chen, operating under an assumed identity in a downtown corporate office for 3 years, was identified through the financial trail Jae-won's people had assembled and arrested on charges that included racketeering, conspiracy, and a number of things that the federal prosecutor described as presenting a compelling and well-documented case. His lawyer was better than Dae-ho's. It didn't significantly help. The folder Zara had carried out of that warehouse went to the district attorney's office with a cover letter from the forensic accountant and a civil rights attorney who had been following Carol's case. The foreman's statement, combined with the existing fraud and arson charges, produced a superseding indictment. Carol Renee Okafor was additionally charged with criminal negligence resulting in death and conspiracy to commit murder in second degree. She entered a guilty plea 7 months later, negotiated down from the original charges, and was sentenced to 14 years. She would serve at least 9. Zara was in the courtroom the day Carol was sentenced. She had not planned to be. She decided that morning, standing in her closet in the house she and Jae-won shared, that she needed to be there. Not to gloat, not for closure, which she had stopped believing was a single moment a long time ago. She needed to be a witness. She needed to see it with her own eyes so that the part of her brain that had spent 3 years believing it had no power could finally receive the update. She wore her mother's color, emerald green, no scarf. The land her father had refused to sell was 2¼ acres in a quadrant of Atlanta that had, exactly as Marcus had predicted, become extremely valuable. After 18 months of legal work and estate proceedings and a conversation with an architect that made Zara cry twice and laugh once, they broke ground on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The Tobias Okafor Pavilion would be the central building of what was now the Grace Okafor Center's flagship campus. There would be a community kitchen, which felt important. There would be residences for young people aging out of foster care, which had been in Zara's original blueprint since she had any resources to build it. There would be a garden, which had been her father's idea in a journal she'd found in a box from the estate, a journal she hadn't known existed. 30 pages of his handwriting about what he'd hoped to do with that land someday. He'd written about a garden specifically. He'd written about it being open to anyone who needed it. He had been building the same dream she had from the other end. Jae-won stood beside her at the groundbreaking with his hand at the small of her back and said nothing out loud, but she could feel what he was feeling, the way she'd learned to over 4 years of paying attention to him. She leaned into his shoulder for a moment. He would have liked you. Probably not. She almost laughed. He would have respected you, she amended. Eventually. He turned his head and pressed his mouth to her temple. That's enough, he said. That night, alone in the study of their home, Zara opened the last piece of the story she hadn't shared with anyone. A letter, handwritten, that had arrived 4 weeks after Marcus Chen's arrest from a federal detention facility. She had read it twice and then put it away. She read it a 3rd time now. You look like him. I didn't expect that. Your father had a quality that I have spent my life accumulating power, specifically to avoid in other people. He made you feel that your worst offer was being declined, and that this was entirely appropriate. I am not asking you to forgive what was done. I am not asking you for anything. I am writing to tell you that Tobias Okafor refused to sell on a Tuesday afternoon in October and shook my representative's hand afterward and said he hoped the rest of the meeting had gone well. I have negotiated with hundreds of people. I have never forgotten that handshake. I wanted someone who knew him to know that he was not afraid of me, not ever a little. I thought you should have that. M.C. Zara held the letter for a long time. Then she went to the fireplace they only used in January and lit a match and watched it burn. Not because the words weren't real, because they were, and she didn't need paper to hold them. She had her father's journal. She had 2¼ acres of land. She had his dream, building itself in terracotta and glass on the other side of the city. She had enough. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, a gesture she'd been doing for 3 weeks without telling anyone yet, and breathed. She had more than enough. At the first anniversary of the pavilion's groundbreaking, Zara stood at a microphone in front of a crowd that had grown into the hundreds, a crowd that included former residents of the center, community members, city officials who had complicated feelings about Jaewon Shin's philanthropic footprint but had stopped expressing them publicly, and one photographer from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who would later say it was the best assignment she'd had that year. Zara was 7 months along and had refused every suggestion that she stand farther back or sit down. She wore ivory again, a different dress, and she left her neck and collarbone bare as she always did now. She looked out at the crowd and found Jaewon in the back, which is where he always stood at these things, making room for her to take up the space she'd spent years being told she didn't deserve. My father wrote in his journal that he wanted to build something that would outlast him. He didn't know how right he was, or maybe he did. I think he might have. Some people are just built with that kind of knowing. She paused. I spent a long time believing that I was someone other people had the right to define. I believed it because enough people said it loud enough and long enough that it started to sound like the truth. It wasn't the truth. It was just noise, loud noise dressed up as a verdict. She paused. The truth is that what you do with what's been done to you, that's the part you actually own. My father owned his. I'm learning to own mine. And this building, she said, looking up at the name cut into warm stone above the doors, is what it looks like when you refuse to let the noise be the last word. The applause was long. Jaewon caught her eye from the back of the crowd. His expression was the one she had memorized, because it wasn't about power or precision or any of the machinery of the world he'd spent a decade navigating. It was simpler, and it was older than all of that. It was just him, looking at her, like she was the most interesting thing in the world. The way he'd looked at her from the moment she'd walked out of a warehouse on the east side with a folder in her hand and told him to choose clean over revenge. She smiled. He smiled back.
The story her father had started on 2¼ acres of Atlanta ground was not finished. It had barely started. Their daughter would be born 6 weeks later in a hospital 2 miles from the center, and they would name her Grace Tobias Shin, and she would have her grandmother's name and her grandfather's stubbornness and her mother's eyes. Zara would sit in the hospital room the night after and hold her daughter in the particular silence of someone who has survived everything that was supposed to stop her, and she would think about the woman in the hoodie on Peachtree Street, the one who had been so certain the story was already over. She had been so wrong. She had been so gloriously, completely, irreversibly wrong. And if you stayed through to the end of this one, I need you to drop a comment and tell me what got you. Was it Tobias's letter, the pavilion, that last night in the warehouse when she walked out alone? Your comments are how I know these stories are landing where they're supposed to. Like this if you're glad you stayed. Share it with someone who needs to hear today that the noise is not the verdict. Subscribe because there are more stories exactly like this one. Stories about women who held on when everything said let go, and love that arrived with its eyes open. I'll see you in the next one. Remember, the chapter you're in is not the last one. The best part of your story might still be on its way.